So 3 things I'm going to be talking about today. The mission of the Corps of Engineers, the organization, how the Corps is put together to implement this mission, and finally, and the most important thing, is to talk about support for funding the Corps of Engineers programs. So the first question you might have is, why are we starting out like this? And that's because the mission of the Corps of Engineers is the second most frequently asked question that I receive at the Bay Model, where I volunteer as a docent. My wife and I volunteer there. The Corps of Engineers Bay Model in Sausalito. I'll anticipate your question. What is the most frequently asked question at the Bay Model? And that is, where are the restrooms? So, again, these are the first, and then I'm just putting up a handful of missions there because I was limited to 2 slides and some font that you can actually read, because it would take about 20 slides to go over all the things that the Corps of Engineers does. And I'm going to concentrate on the civil works portion. So you, not on there is kind of what I did for most of my career with the Corps of Engineers, and that's the warfighting mission, the huge element of the Corps of Engineers. But let's go into the civil works. And primarily what I think most of this audience is interested in, civil works and military construction. Is that part of civil works? Well, yes, and that's kind of associated with the warfighting. But as most of you know, the Corps of Engineers supports engineering, design, construction management on Army installations and Air Force installations. We're working on the Navy. So, civil works, water resources, navigation, flood control, etc. And I put in emergency response, but it's really emergency management. So not only does the Corps of Engineers respond to anthropogenic and natural disasters like Katrina, but also the Corps is very actively involved in managing emergencies. Regulatory, what a lot of folks don't understand, you'll hear more about this later, is the Corps has a regulatory, a very important regulatory function, and that the basis for that, of course, is the Clean Water Act and the River and Harbors Navigation Act of 1899. And that sets up the regulatory mission of the Corps of Engineers, and then more about that later. And there's other missions that the Corps of Engineers does in FUDs, which is formally utilized defense sites, a lot of cleanup of old mines. So the Corps is involved in that. And then the final thing I want to touch on, because it's the most important, again, of interest of you, I think, is the water resources. And underwater resources, you have the, of course, navigation, where most of our goods come into the United States, and the Corps is responsible for all of the elements associated with both deep draft harbors, inland waters, and even smaller harbors. And then also flood control, flood management, coastal protection, all those things. What a lot of people don't understand, and again, what folks are kind of amazed to hear about at the Bay Model, is that the Corps is also involved in hydroelectric, water supply, and recreation, providing it's a recreation component. And I just recently had some visitors that went through the Bay Model, and then we went up to Lake Sonoma, and these folks from China were amazed at that, in fact, most of our reservoirs are multi-purpose, not just a single purpose, not just flood control, but water supply, recreation, hydroelectric, and so on. So, next slide. So, how is the Corps organized to do this? The Corps of Engineers has a boss. That's always good. It's always good to have. I have several bosses. But that would be Joe Allen Darcy, who is Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. So that is the civilian lead of the Corps of Engineers. Then under that is headquarters, USACE, Headquarters Corps of Engineers in Washington, D.C., currently led by Lieutenant General Bostic, and the civilian lead is our old friend Steve Stockton, who actually came from here, was actually part of South Pacific Division. So the Corps of Engineers is organized into 8 divisions in the United States, 2 divisions elsewhere, mostly, as you might imagine, in the Gulf region. And then under those 8 divisions are 45 districts. So we drop down another level. So here, the division is South Pacific Division. And there you see the map of South Pacific Division. And unlike this earlier version of this button, Albuquerque District is actually spelled correctly. Very important. I actually have, Corey doesn't know this, but I have an earlier coin that has it spelled incorrectly. That's going to be valuable someday. Anyway, there's 4 districts under South Pacific Division. You see them listed here: Albuquerque, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sacramento. And then what a funny shape to that division and those districts. And that's because districts have 2 sets of boundaries: watershed and a political boundary. So that's the organization of the Corps of Engineers. And then the final thing I want to talk about, to hopefully get us back on schedule, is a very, very important takeaway point. And that is the Corps of Engineers absolutely needs your support. Please continue to work with the administration and your congressional delegation to support the Corps of Engineers missions, all of them. Everything from planning, with the planning phase that you're going to hear about, all the way through design, construction management. It's very important because the folks in this room, we are it in terms of providing the necessary funds. I'm going to give a quote from Steve Stockton before I sit down, and his quote is, "Where is the outrage?" Because we, and primarily the ports, continue to put lots and lots of money into something called the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and very little of that, less than 10% of what we put in, comes back to us in California. Less than 10%. I'm not going to go into where the rest of it goes, but it's not coming back. And we absolutely need that to support the Corps' missions. And then finally, a final thing is, when you're looking at supporting the Corps' missions, the projects are important, but look at what goes before the projects, including something called the Long-Term Management Study, LTMS, for dredging and the beneficial reuse of dredged material. So that's the final thing. Any questions for me? We'll go back in.
Anybody need a blue card?
Thank you very much.